One of the hardest things to do in MMA, apart from actually fighting, of course that is bloody difficult in itself, is to stay undefeated. Not only are there so many ways to lose, but we've seen just about anything can and will happen at any moment. And if you're in the UFC and regularly going up against guys on your level, it's usually only a matter of time. It's a simple fact that if you stick around long enough, everybody loses. The only person I can think of in the history of the promotion who didn't is Nurmagomedov. Now that's just in the UFC before you get on at me, and now that he's done it, it does feel like someone just might be able to do it again. We've seen it once, it's definitely possible. But out of everyone with an O next to their name at the moment, who is actually the best? So with all that in mind, I'm Bailey in from MMA On Point. Thank you as always to our YouTube Hall of Fame members for supporting the channel, and here are the 10 best undefeated fighters in the UFC. Number 10, Lon Murphy. Out of all these top 10 undefeated fighters, I'm not going to lie, it is nice to see at least one Englishman currently in the rankings, but considering this was already so hard to narrow down with there being 34 undefeated fighters currently on the UFC roster, why did Lon Murphy take the number 10 spot? Well, for a start, in just 6 UFC fights, a miracle has managed to find his way into the UFC rankings, which are at times more impenetrable than an Imperial Starbase. Lon has demonstrated powerful and dynamic striking, as well as submission threats and great cardio that has lasted well across 15 minutes. He's also proven that he can wrestle, and it's his ability to threaten and also finish in any position that has kept him undefeated. Not unusually, Lon was given a seriously tough UFC debut. He was a 5-1 underdog against Zubaira Tukhugov, and he took him to a draw. Next, he had another tough opponent against Ricardo Ramos. He was again an underdog, but finished him in the first round. And even against Makwan Amirkhani, he was held down for the entire first round, but immediately KO'd him with a knee at the start of the second. Now, those were all great performances, but none of those guys are what you would call the best of the division. Lon then also sat out injured after surviving a near-fatal bicycle accident and has returned to the UFC since with 2 very close decisions. So some people have their doubts, but even in those fights, it's been Lon's ability to adapt mid-fight and be well-rounded that's kept him undefeated, and it's also what makes him so promising. But he's number 10 because he has yet to face any truly elite competition, but he's still undefeated. Number 9, Azamat Murzakanov. This undefeated light heavyweight comes from the Caucasus Mountains, and although some of you might not actually have heard of him, Azamat is currently 13-0, has 3 wins in the UFC, and is ranked number 12 at 205. They call him the professional, and Murzakanov has spent the last 13 years fighting across the globe and pretty much knocking everyone out with his devastating power. And when you do have power like that, it's going to get you pretty far. Azamat kind of reminds me of a southpaw Russian Dan Henderson. He constantly moves forward with his left hand, ready to throw bombs. After the pandemic, Azamat showed up on the Contender Series, and it took him just 3 minutes to KO his opponent with pretty much the first shot he landed. And we've seen his cardio hold out well in the UFC. He's been able to get finishes in the 3rd round. He's even beaten UFC veterans like Devin Clark. All of that got him to rank 15, but the best indicator of his abilities by far was his win over the number 11 guy, Dustin Jacoby. Dustin is a world-class kickboxer and was 7-1 in his UFC run, but the fact the professional outpointed him across 3 rounds and even dropped him says tons about his current level and potential. Number 8, Muhammad Mokaev. There's a few of these undefeated fighters who you could see holding a UFC title someday, and like him or hate him, I genuinely think Muhammad Mokaev might just be one of those guys. He's from Dagestan, and he's been training with guys like Tom Aspinall in England since a young age, but aside from his 23-0 amateur career and now going 10-0 as a pro, he's also in a weight class where there aren't a lot of UFC contenders, and at just 23 years old, even if it takes him a few years, I think he's probably going to be fighting for the belt. Let's talk about his career though. If you don't know what the IMAFs are, they are essentially world championship level MMA, but at the amateur level. Mokaev won the 2019 and 2020 World Championships. Since going pro, he's kept an undefeated record fighting in the UK, but also in Brave, mainly getting the job done with his high-level wrestling and grappling game, utilizing a seemingly endless gas tank to land takedown after takedown, where he'll work for submissions or sometimes work for ground and pound. He couldn't have had a more emphatic UFC debut, a 60-second submission over Cody Durden, but he's also been tested and come out the other side. Malcolm Gordon took his back and threatened to sub him before Mokaev reversed the position, and basically the same thing happened against Jafal Fio, where his knee was shredded, but then he immediately neck cranked the guy. Mokaev's been in some bad spots and he's got out of them, but most impressively, he recently managed to submit the veteran Tim Elliott with an arm triangle, which put him at number 10 in the rankings after just 5 UFC fights. Sometimes fans have felt Muhammad has been outworked or outmuscled for positions, or he's not been aggressive enough though, but he is on a 3-fight submission streak in the UFC, and his grappling really is next level. It's only top opponents from here though, and we'll see him properly get tested. Number 7, Umar Namaga. Could there be any more pressure on you to stay undefeated in the UFC if your last name is Nurmagomedov? Well, yeah, also having Khabib in your corner shouting at you to make sure you stay that way as well. Training with his uncle Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, Umar has been molded since childhood into a combat sports world champion, winning the Sambo World Championships at just 19. Combine that with the striking, he's been obviously working with coach Javier Mendez at AKA, and Umar is now 16-0 and an unbeaten force in the UFC bantamweight division. From his UFC debut, we got to see that although he has the same name, he has an entirely different game to Khabib. Umar's kicks are extremely fast, he's super flexible, but also has an absolutely world-class grappling game that has made him a nightmare for everyone he's faced so far. Back-to-back finishes in his first 2 UFC fights says a lot, and he showed off both his striking and submission skills. Then against Nate Manez, Umar was able to show his wrestling. He stacked up 10 minutes of control time and outlanded him 74 significant strikes to just 2. His last fight was against the vet Honey Barcelos, and he was as high as a -850 favorite. So as impressive as another first-round TKO was, we now need to see Umar face higher levels of competition. Number 6, Movsar Evloev. It is kind of strange that after being in the UFC for so long and stacking up as many wins as he has, Movsar has turned into somewhat of a forgettable fighter in his division. Not trying to be mean, but it is kind of true. He arrived to the UFC in 2019 after spending his entire pro career before that in M1 Global in Russia, where he won and defended the title. But what makes Movsar so good? He's just a real patient customer. He has great movement, knows exactly when to engage. That combined with his master of sport and Greco-Roman wrestling means that whenever he feels like it's the right time, he takes the fight to the mat. Evloev has had 7 fights in the UFC against varying levels of competition, and he's won them all, but every single one of them has also gone to decision. That doesn't mean he hasn't been extremely dominant at times, but at 17-0, he's currently ranked 8th in the featherweight division, with the highest profile opponent he's beaten being Dan Ige. And even in that fight, despite being ranked below him, the Russian was a -425 favorite, but he still couldn't finish the UFC veteran. Aside from his great composure and well-roundedness, it does feel like the only thing holding him back is himself. As of yet, he's not met anyone who he couldn't outpoint, but the rest of the guys above him in the division are all killers and most likely will bring more of a fight out of him. Still, he's one of the most well-rounded and effective undefeated fighters in the UFC. Number 5, Ian Garry. So with at least some of these undefeated fighters, they started their UFC careers around 2019 and have managed to break inside the UFC rankings since then. So when you find out Ian Garry has done the same thing, but 2019 was a year he turned pro, it's pretty impressive. By 2021, he'd won 7 fights and the Cage Warriors title. Now, I'm not going to lie, Cage Warriors was almost a bit too easy for Ian. He demolished pretty much everyone, which, to be honest, only gave people a few more doubts when he got to the UFC because they hadn't really seen the limits of his ability. Ian has always been a devastating striker. He's got power for sure, but it's his speed, accuracy, and ability to read his opponents and set up finishing sequences that have made the future truly special. He can fight while moving forwards or back, and all of that has taken him to now 13-0 and number 10 in the UFC welterweight rankings. He didn't exactly have flawless performances early in his UFC career, but in 2023 we saw Ian step up and show his true potential. He broke into the rankings when he knocked out the number 15 guy D-Rod in just the first round after completely controlling the action, and then he just put on a record-breaking performance over a veteran and staple of the division Neil Magny with a flawless 10-8, 10-8, 10-8 on one of the scorecards. Ian's ability to get better and better has only increased, and who knows where his ceiling is. As well as all that, he has an undeniable belief in himself that has only made him more dangerous and helped him stay undefeated. Number 4, Khamzat Chimaev. At least at first, the abilities of Khamzat Chimaev seemed almost unlimited. I also think that he carries the aura of an undefeated fighter perhaps better than anyone on this list. Part of his success has also been his absolutely uncompromising will and belief that he is the best and no one will ever beat him and he's going to kill everybody. What really has made Boars stay undefeated though primarily has been his wrestling ability to end the fight before it even starts with one takedown and a quick submission. And in at least 70% of his fights, that's all he's ever needed to do. After 7 UFC fights, he's now ranked number 9 at middleweight, but before that he was sat inside the top 5 at welterweight and was seemingly in line for a title shot based on his performances and his win over Gilbert Burns that catapulted him to the top of the division. Inside the first 2 minutes, he might just be the best fighter in this top 10, but we have seen that when someone can meet him in the grappling department like Burns did, or even Kamaru Usman was able to, he becomes a different fighter and has to rely on his other skills, which has led to the only decision wins in his career. Khamzat also at this point needs to fight more high caliber opponents in his own weight class to further establish himself as one of the best at 185. At number 9 in the rankings, he's going to have plenty of chances to do that, and if people can't stop his initial wrestling attack, then he's going to cause people more problems. Number 3, Ilia Toria. Okay, I can definitely see if immediately you want to put Ilia Toria higher than number 3 on this list. He's currently ranked number 5 at featherweight, and apart from Max Holloway, he's also the only guy inside the top 5 of that division who's even coming off a win at the moment. But let's just talk about why Ilia is undefeated. Most people know at this point that he's one of the best grapplers in the division, even if you haven't seen too much of it yet. He was the first BJJ black belt from Georgia, which if you don't know is a country that borders Dagestan, and you know they are serious about their grappling down there. But he's also got absolute sledgehammers in his hands, with 3 finishes in different weight classes. With all of that in mind, it's not actually surprising then that he was able to negate and finish 2 outstanding submission artists in Ryan Hall and Bryce Mitchell, and both of those guys hadn't lost at that level to anyone. But he also fought Josh Emmett, who was absolutely at the top of that division, although Ilia wasn't able to finish him, and we have seen on occasion he has been in a bit of adversity.
Nice head kick by Kazan! Has he caught him?
Although he is about to fight for the title, he has a lot of other UFC featherweights he hasn't clashed with yet, and we don't know how his skill set will actually match up with the champion because of that. But we are about to find out. Until then, we know 2 things. Toria really is a dangerous guy for anyone to fight, and he has proved it. But is he as much of a threat to his division's champion as the next 2 entries in this video? Number 2, Shaktar Rakmanov. I absolutely love that everyone who is a fight fan unanimously enjoys the work of Shaktar Rakmanov. Unless you're some kind of folk-style wrestling lover, there isn't a thing about him that isn't fan-friendly. Through a combination of perfect timing and accuracy, the Nomad's totally dynamic striking has dismantled 17 other welterweights across his career. And pretty much half of those were also unlucky enough to end up on the ground with him, where he has a ferocious ground and pound and submission game. But why is he number 2? Well, I think one of the main reasons is because he's finished every single person he's fought, including all 5 UFC opponents. That's taken him to spot number 5 in the rankings, and out of all those top 5 in the division right now, he is the biggest threat to the champion Leon Edwards. He has not only a complete MMA game with seemingly no flaws, but he is the definition of killer instinct, which makes him extremely dangerous at all times, and not only the scariest undefeated fighter in the UFC, but perhaps the best as well, unless you're the number 1 spot. But before we get to that, we're going to make some honorable mentions. Like I said, guys, after going through them, there's 34 undefeated fighters currently on the UFC roster, so it's understandable if someone you wanted to be in the top 10 didn't make it. Of course, one name not on this list is Bo Nickel. I mean, the guy has looked more dominant than perhaps any prospect with his experience level in the history of the sport, but that's also the thing, isn't it? He has only had 2 UFC fights, and they were against pretty much nobodies. 2024 is probably going to tell us a lot more about Bo Nickel. Here's a few other guys who also deserve a mention. Javid Basharat, 14-0, 3 UFC wins, 1 no contest. Also, the new Japanese star Tatsuro Taira, he's 14-0 with 4 UFC wins, and Michael Morales, who's 16-0 with 4 UFC wins as well. All of these guys are well on their way in the UFC, and they're all great fighters, but they haven't broken into the UFC rankings quite yet, and the rest of the people on this list already have. But let's get on to number 1, Tatiana Suarez. Okay, so there's a few reasons I think you have to land Tatiana at this number 1 spot. She has honestly been about as dominant, if not more so, as the likes of Ronda Rousey and Valentina Shevchenko. What makes her so good? Well, let's start with the fact that before she started her MMA career, she won multiple gold medals at the BJJ World Championships and in freestyle wrestling. And it's been just that. Her grappling, compared to the other women she has faced, has been on an entirely different level. Throughout this top 10, all these guys have been good, but no one aside from maybe Hamzat early on has shown the same level of absolute complete dominance. If you don't know Tatiana, just think of a female Khabib in terms of the control she has shown over her opponents. After winning the Ultimate Fighter in 2016, she already looked ready to fight for a world title, but at one point she had to take a 3.5-year hiatus because of recurring injuries. She's already finished 3 UFC champions in Carla Esparza, Jessica Andrade, and even Alexa Grasso, so we know that she's just as good against the very best in the division, and that's also not something you could say for anyone else on this list. I sure hope she fights for the title sometime soon. She's currently ranked number 3 at strawweight, but has fought at flyweight as well, and I think a fight against Weili or even a rematch with Alexa is the only fight to make for her. Tatiana is one of those people who I could definitely see being undefeated for the rest of her career. Yeah, I didn't think there were that many undefeated fighters in the UFC. Either 34 is a pretty big number, but I think these guys are the top 10. Shout out as always to Max Randall. Thank you, Max. You always do a great job smashing these edits for these videos. Say thank you to him at Max Randall or at the Combat Arcade, his new channel. I want to say thank you to those of you who are our MMA On Point channel champions here through the members program. Thank you for signing up to that. We appreciate your support. You can join them, guys, if you want by clicking the button or the link down below. Tons of benefits to becoming a member on the channel, so special thank you to those guys as well. If you think there was someone who really deserved a mention and they didn't get it, go ahead, leave us a comment down below. Fight me. All right, thank you very much, guys. You can go now. I'm done talking. This is just where the screen goes black. I just keep rambling on and say thank you for the video. Am I still here? What?